Welcome. Special thanks to our hosts tonight at Hawks and Reed. It's an awesome venue. You can find out information about Hawks and Reed and everything they do on their website or on their Facebook page. Thank you so much to them for hosting us tonight.
And again, welcome to our final Valley Voices stop of the series. We have 10 storytellers who are going to share a 5-minute true story without notes for you on the theme Open Road. And at the end of the show, it will be up to you to choose your top 2 favorite stories of the evening.
Like Kaitlyn said, at the end of the night, it's up to you to choose the winner. Everybody should have a ballot that looks like this. All right, well, without further ado, let's bring up our first storyteller of the night.
Hi, I'm Lisa Williams. I don't look like a drug dealer. My preppy boyfriend didn't look like a drug dealer, so it had to be the car. And it really was quite a car. It was an old Mercedes 190 convertible, the kind of car that the really cool European guys drive in 60s movies. But it didn't look its best that day. It was as though, imagine you saw Jackie Kennedy walking down the sidewalk, only she's dressed like a homeless person and pushing a shopping cart with all her stuff in it. I think that's how the Highway Patrol saw us. Tom and I had taken some time out from college to work in a resort in Arizona for the winter. When it was over, we had a problem. We had driven west in caravan with a friend of ours who was moving to LA, and everything that didn't fit into the 190, we just threw in the back of his giant Volvo. But here we were with more stuff and no Volvo. We had to find a way to pack 6 months worth of living into a 2-seater with a trunk the size of a mailbox. Tom's solution was to build a custom carrier that fit on the back of the convertible and sat on top of the trunk. It was basically a giant plywood box, a very inelegant solution, but it worked great, and we set out. Our second day on the road began very early in the morning in Gallup, New Mexico. I, of course, fell asleep immediately in the passenger seat. I was awakened by sirens and flashing lights and a highway patrolman pounding on the window. Please exit your vehicle. We need your license and registration. Tom and I were frozen. We didn't know anything about cops. We were too young to have faced off as 60s protesters. But we did as we were told. And as one of the highway patrolmen looked at the paperwork, the other one told us to start getting our stuff out of the car. So I emptied out the passenger compartment, which was easy, while Tom dealt with the padlock on the carrier that we had. And then we started unpacking. And we opened every suitcase. We emptied every box. We had our clothes and our swimwear and our sheets and our towels. Everything had to be unfolded and shaken out and thrown on the side of the road. And we had our hiking boots and our riding boots and our earth shoes and our tap shoes all on the side of the road. We had my grandmother's Afghan and our camera and our rolls of film. When the carrier box was empty, the highway patrolman told us to open the trunk. And Tom explained that we couldn't do that. We hadn't expected to have to open it until we got home, so we didn't have the tools to move the carrier box to get to the trunk. The highway patrolman looked at us and at each other like, yeah, right. And they radioed, we need backup with a toolbox. So we stood there. We stood there in the blazing desert sun. And while we'd been there, traffic had picked up, so there's semis and there's pickups and there's station wagons flying past. And every one of them has humans in it, and they're all looking at us as they go by. Finally, the backup arrived, and Tom and I, with no assistance from the now 4 highway patrolmen who were watching, we dismantled the mounts that held the carrier onto the back of the car. And we opened the trunk, and we unloaded. We had some boxes of books, we had some binders with sheet music, we had folders of some stories I'd been writing, and okay, we had a couple of cases of Coors. Well, even though the car was now completely empty, the highway patrol was not ready to admit defeat. They took their flashlights and they went nose to tail on this car. They went under the floor mats, they went in the wheel wells, in the engine compartment, everywhere. Finally, they seemed to admit defeat. Sorry for the inconvenience. And they got in their cars and drove away. And we looked at each other, and we looked at this mountain of stuff around us in the sand, and armed only with a Swiss Army knife, we started putting everything back together again. We finally got back on the road probably about 6 hours after the initial stop. And I don't know what the moral of this story is. We got home, everything was fine, nothing changed because of that day, but it still seems important. It seems important that I remember, that people like me remember, that terrible vulnerability and that sense of powerlessness that we felt there on the side of the road with the highway patrolman looking at us and all of our stuff laid out there on the side of the road for no reason at all. Thank you.
My name is Jonathan Wilkinson. Tens of thousands of miles and dozens of countries, dozens of cities, I watched our wonderful country go by from the vestibule of the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey circus train as I worked as a professional clown. My clown name was Moose, go figure. That was 80 pounds ago, so I will not be modeling my clown costume for you. It fits me like a condom. The circus is filled to overflowing with interesting, unique, talented individuals of every stripe and color. Strongmen from Poland, contortionists from Mongolia, acrobats from Mexico, etc., etc., etc. It's the most diverse arena you will find anywhere. To me, the most unique person on the show was a man named Mishu. He was Hungarian, late 30s. His claim to fame? Smallest man in the world, 33 inches tall, which is that tall. He'd been in and around circuses his whole life. He was very well liked, very popular. Well, when you travel on the circus train and the train pulls into town, they break it up into 5, 6, 7, 8 different parts, depending upon what is most convenient for the working people. Well, when you are outside of the train and you want to get on the train, you obviously do it by the vestibule. Not that easy always. The vestibule, you will have to open the door and latch it, then grab the floor that is on a hinge and you bring that up, thus exposing the steps. Well, the bottom step is a good 2 feet off the ground, very awkward, so they keep a footstool on the vestibule. They take the footstool, they grind it into the gravel, nice and secure, so you step on the footstool and access the bottom step. Well, for the little people like Mishu, not dwarves, not midgets, little people, they actually make a flight of stairs with 4 steps. So they walk up the 4 steps, access the bottom step of the train. Well, one day the train had arrived in town, I got out, I'm walking along, and Mishu is standing outside of his train car. There are no steps and everything is closed up. He's kind of sunk and he says, "You, come help me." So I go over, I open the door, I take the floor, and I take Mishu and put him on the bottom step. He's very grateful. He says, "You, come. This is a big moment for me." He was quite a star. So we walk down the aisle to his room. Well, we come to a normal-sized door with the keyhole. Okay, so he gets out his keys, he opens it, slides the door open, and I step into his room, and this giant grin just consumes my face. This is a room that's meant for an adult, but an adult that is this tall. There's a bed that's this long. There's a sink and a stove and a countertop that's, okay, and everything is made for somebody that size, including the furniture. He says, come in. And I said, my hands are filthy from fiddling with the vestibule. And I said, can I wash my hands? He goes, oh, sure, go ahead. Okay. He goes, you like a drink? He's Eastern European, Hungarian. I said, sure, they love vodka. You know, it's 11:15, why not? So, well, you or I going to have a drink. We take a bottle and a glass, and we... No, when you're 33 inches tall, you slide the bottle over under your hip, wrap your arm around it, hold the neck, and bring it back up. Well, we had one drink, then we had a second drink, and it was really quite pleasant. And that was the most unusual drink I had ever had in my life until the next day. The circus opened that night. We had a great show, and attached to the building we were playing was a wonderful bar filled with circus people cutting loose. You work very hard, you play very hard. And Mishu is standing on top of a bar stool, which is what you do. You don't put him down on the ground, you put him up. And he's drinking and smoking and holding court. Well, a showgirl comes in, and she is on crutches, and he very graciously offers his chair to the woman. Long story short, I take Mishu, who's in his late 30s, slide him over onto my hip, and hold him like an infant. And he has a drink in one hand and a cigarette in the other, and I've got a beer in my hand, and that's how we spent the next 45 minutes. And that is the most unusual drink I have ever had. Thank you.
Hi, I am Kathryn Petruccelli. Driving Route 58 East, bearing down on Barstow, California, in all of its hot, empty nothingness, headed for a campground in the Mojave Desert National Preserve. So, I'm an ocean girl. The desert feels made up. There was a jackrabbit running beside our van. There was a side-winding snake actually drawing pictures in the dirt. There were tracks we found that looked suspiciously like Roadrunner, because people, that is apparently a real thing. We saw owl pellets and petroglyphs, and it was late May. The desert was in bloom, so out of the dust, it was red and orange and yellow. The place was virtually mythical. This is half the reason to go on a road trip in the first place, to dream beyond what you already know and who you already are. It was day 3 of a 5.5-week trek that was going to take us from California to Massachusetts. The van we were driving had a cassette player in it, only. And we planned super well, so we had one cassette tape in the van. It was a homemade compilation of 70s music. Any guesses as to how many times you have to hear the song, "I Will Survive," before you have 0 will to survive? I can actually tell you, on a scale of California to Massachusetts, it's around Utah. So we had no music, no soundtrack to speak of, no smartphones at the time, no music. Instead, I wrote. I was a blogger with a small but dedicated audience, and I was a freelance journalist. I had even pitched the road trip to a few of the papers, hoping to catch some interest. I got a very nice rejection letter from the Boston Globe. But I kept trying because writers want audiences. So we set up shop in Mojave under these rock formations like I had never seen. Incredible. My husband and my 6-year-old went out exploring. I was pregnant at the time and tired, so I decided to stay back in the van and rest. And after a little while, I started to hear this rustling sound outside, and immediately I thought, ooh, it's got to be some mythical desert creature out there just waiting for me to discover it and write it up and share its story with my limited but dedicated audiences. So I go out to check. It's our trash bag flapping around in the breeze. But after I stopped that, I could hear this other sound that had been hidden under that noise. It was music, this gorgeous, lilting music that was like reverberating around the rock faces. It just kind of filled me from the inside. And I tried to convince myself that, okay, this is somebody's downloaded playlist, somebody who has prepared much better than we did for their road trip. But I kept listening, and it became clear this was no device. Someone was singing. I looked to my left, maybe about 400 feet, and there was a man tying something to a minivan roof. And he turned his head, and it was him. He was singing. He was completely alone, singing to the desert, just because, I guess. I couldn't really take it in. I mean, I was alone, but maybe for half an hour. I was the blogger looking for comments, and I was the freelance journalist with a hopeful byline. I was not the person who came to sing to the red hills in the solitude of the desert, whether or not anyone else witnessed it. There was an amazing array of personalities that I met on this trip that changed me. There were the people excavating a sinkhole in South Dakota of the woolly mammoth skeletons. There were the Amish in Pennsylvania. And there was my conversation as a 3 decades-long vegetarian with a pig farmer in a bar. But this first desert memory, we get to be one person. I am your ocean girl. But out on the road, it's like some part of us breaks down a little bit to let in the magic reflecting off people wildly different than we are. And that's a good thing. Thanks.
My name is Oran Kaufman. In the spring of 1986, I was finishing up my first year of law school, and I was neck deep in torts, contracts, and civil procedure. So when a friend of mine that was in law school with me suggested that we go to California for a bike trip, I jumped on it. I didn't exactly jump on it. You see, I had never been on a bike trip before. But Danielle had ridden cross-country twice. She had led bike trips. She knew how to fix a flat tire. She knew how to true a tire. So I thought that was pretty good, and I felt like I was in pretty good hands. My mom, on the other hand, didn't think it was a very good idea. You see, at the time, I was kind of still going out with somebody else. I say kind of because she was moving to D.C., and I was living in Boston, and we were kind of on the out, but not exactly. And my mom said to me, "What do you mean you're going on a trip with another woman?" Now, my mom, unfortunately, is usually right. But we were just friends, and I was convinced that we were just friends, and so we went on the trip. So even on the plane ride, as Danielle put her head on my lap innocently to sleep, what was directly in my eyes staring at me, I was kind of suppressing because I was still kind of going out with somebody else, and it was not right. But the little percolating thing had started to happen, and if you've been in love, you know what I'm talking about. So we get to California, and we spent a couple of nights with some friends of hers, and the first day of my first bike trip was 12 miles straight uphill. And I'm like, I couldn't believe this. Like, I did not sign up for this. Give me civil procedure any day. I mean, it was like straight uphill. It was hot, and I'm huffing and I'm puffing, and I'm cursing Danielle under my breath, and at the same time thinking, I really like this woman. The saving grace was that I was staring at her butt all day. So that helped a little bit. And the other thing is that, like, when you go up, you got to go down. So we get to the top, and the 6 to 8 hours, I don't remember, it was all day, of going uphill resulted in 5 minutes of straight downhill at 35 miles an hour on 2 thin tires, and the thrill of that is just incredible. And there's, like, in my head, there's like the day is ricocheting between love and going downhill and struggling and going out with somebody, and I shouldn't. Anyway, it was an incredible day, and life was kind of telescoped into that one day. We ended up spending the night under the stars, camping out in the California desert. But then the next day, things got really interesting. We got up early at about 7 o'clock in the morning and started biking. We'd biked all day, and we get to a little town on the edge of Camp Pendleton. Now, Camp Pendleton is one of the biggest Army bases in the United States, 30 miles across. This was a seedy little town with seedy little motels and seedy little bars, and Danielle was going to have nothing of it. And I had already learned by this point that one thing that I've learned over the years is your partner's always right. So she said, we're not staying here, we're going. So I said, all right, we're going. Now the problem was that in the distance were these incredibly looking black clouds, and it was looking like it was going to pour. She was determined to go ahead, so we said, okay, go ahead. We start biking, and sure enough, rain came. And sure enough, darkness came. Now, I think back on it now, and I think, what the hell were we doing biking through an Army base? I mean, I don't know how that was even allowed, but we were. And this was before, we didn't know what was on the other side of it even. So we're biking along, and once again, I'm huffing and puffing, rain is pouring down, I'm thinking, what the hell, what is this hell ride that I agreed to do, and why am I doing this? But we kept going, and eventually in the distance, and we thought about camping, but decided that those big signs that we saw that said tank crossings was probably not a good idea. And I'm not talking moose crossing, I'm talking tank crossing. We eventually saw a light in the distance, and we ride to the light, and by miracle, we ended up at a Cub Scout jamboree. And in this big building were hundreds of kids hopped up on sugar, running around like crazy with their little suits, with their, Cub Scout suits, I mean. But for us, the most important thing was the den mothers. They couldn't wait to mother us and bring us in, and we were like two wet rats. Went inside, they helped us dry off, they gave us food. We ended up spending the night with the hundreds of little Cub Scouts, watching them do their little Cub Scout skits, eating popcorn, drinking Swiss Miss chocolate, and life was good. The next morning, the sun came out, our clothes were dry, and we headed off. And I had, at this point, come to the conclusion that I couldn't ignore anymore, that I had fallen madly in love. And I don't know whether it was the bike shorts or the popcorn or anything. Love is kind of like that. Well, it's been 34 years and many bike trips. Danielle and I just celebrated our 31st anniversary. Our daughter last year biked cross country following in her mother's foot pedals. And I don't know, and I like biking now because it's life. There's uphills, there's downhills, there's windings in the road, and there's hardships, and there's, you have successes. And all I know at this point, I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't gone on that bike trip. But what I do know is that I can't wait till the next bike trip. Thank you.
I'm Jenny Powers. My story begins when three of my favorite things came together: Girl Scouts, bargains, and New York City. So you can imagine how excited I was to find $9 round-trip tickets for $25 from Holyoke to New York City. When I got to the bus stop at 6 a.m., all those little shining second-grade faces were so excited. Only one of the girls had been to New York City before, since her dad and I are museum lovers. And of course, we had a few chaperones and other girls, older girls, tagging along with us. So a good Girl Scout should be ready for adventure. She should be cheerful in the face of adversity. And we arrived, got off the bus, onto the subway to our first stop, which was the Girl Scouts National Headquarters right on Fifth Avenue. You could see vintage uniforms, the original Girl Scout cookie boxes. And you could pick up a phone and you could hear how Juliet Gordon Lowe started the organization in 1912 in Savannah, Georgia. We left there and marched through the streets, the girls singing call and response songs in their little brown uniforms, just perfect. Our next stop was Liberty Island, where the girls took turns standing tall with their fists in the air, emulating the statue, enough to soften and inspire patriotism in the very hardest of hearts. We had planned a fairly short day because they were still in second grade, so it was time to head back to the bus. This is when our problems really started. So one of the older tag-alongs had broken her leg and was in a wheelchair. And if you haven't ridden the subway and the ferry with a girl in a wheelchair, it's a challenge. Then we also hadn't planned to stop at Ellis Island, but we didn't realize how long it would take for all of those passengers to get off the ferry there, and then all of those people to get on the ferry there. So by the time we were getting closer to that subway station to get back to the bus stop, we thought, okay, let's hustle. We hustled those girls down to the South Street station, got them all in the subway, and then we sat. Subways run on a schedule, and this one wasn't leaving till it was time. About halfway there to that bus stop, all the moms were looking at our watches saying, this is gonna be tight, this is gonna be tight. We got one of the moms who runs famously in the St. Patrick's Day road race to run ahead and make sure she held the bus. And then I said, okay, girls, let's go. And we ran up those steps. Hopefully, the girl in the wheelchair and her mom were behind us. And we were flying down the street. And if that bus driver would have gone like this, he would have seen half his prepaid passengers running toward him, waving their arms. But alas, he did not. And only the mom, who was a runner, got to see the bus drive away. I blame myself. Only one kid cried, mine. So I passed her off. I tried to make arrangements. There were only 26 standby tickets left, which ruined the bargain because I figured I'd better get those kids home. They got to have their first slice of New York pizza, so they were happy. Then we went over to Herald Square, where some of the girls got to shop in the largest department store in the world. Macy's, right there. Then little things started coming out. Polly Pockets, Uno cards, things they had brought to entertain themselves on the bus. Soon the girls were saying, this is awesome. We got extra time in New York City. By the time it was time to go back to the bus, even the moms were saying it was great. So we got to that bus stop early. It was over some pretty sketchy train tracks, and it was filled with vermin. However, this opportunity to face a challenge and do it successfully came in helpful when just last year, on our pilgrimage to Savannah to see Juliet Gordon-Lowe's home, our flight got canceled. But we talked about it that night, and we remembered. And one of the girls sighed happily and said, Jenny, remember when we got to go to New York City and see those rats? Thank you.
I'm Julie Bermant. He was number 13 of 30 hitchhikers that we picked up that summer. And he entered the VW van and said, I am independently wealthy. I inherited $4,000. My father, who was driving the van, snickered. My mother in the front seat smiled. But I, sitting in the back at 13 in 1971, thought $4,000 was a lot of money. Number 17 slunk into the van. Finally, he shared that when he went to the bathroom in Kansas, he came out to find his backpack and all of his belongings gone. My father gave him a $20 bill as he left the van. Number 23 and 24 were David and Mark. David had a big beard and a long ponytail. Mark was clean-shaven with short hair. And they were very careful about who stood on the side of the road with their thumb out and who hid in the bushes with their backpacks. It was a good thing for them that it was David with his big beard who had his thumb out as we drove by, because we were honoring my long-haired brother who was 17 and had stayed home that summer, and for whom hitchhiking was his favorite mode of transportation. David and Mark stayed with us for 2 days. They played cards with me, the 5 of us told stories, and we all listened to the 3 tapes that I had brought with us on that 30-day trip. Cat Stevens' Tea for the Tillerman, James Taylor's Sweet Baby James, and Elton John's first album. They camped next to us that night. They put their small tent up next to our VW van in a little tiny campsite somewhere in Colorado. The next day, we were really sorry to say goodbye to them. 12 years later, I was driving north from Philadelphia, where I had just moved. I was a new nurse, and I was learning how to live on my own with a salary of $22,000. I was lonely, and so I wanted to meet up with people, and so I had decided to meet a Sierra Club group and go hiking. As I drove north, I listened to Roxanne Cash, and I looked for the place where we were supposed to meet. I drove around and around, and I couldn't find it. Finally, after 45 minutes, I sadly turned the car home. And then, there on the side of the road was a young man with his thumb out, and I pulled over and let him in. Almost as soon as I did that, I thought, what have I done? I'm in the middle of nowhere, and no one knows where I am, with some man with a giant backpack. My heart started racing. I so wished that my mother was in the car with her easy banter, or that my father was in the car with his Hulk and his seriousness. I looked for a place to stop, but for what felt like forever, all I saw were trees. And then, finally, there was an abandoned building, and in front of that abandoned building was a huge driveway, and that driveway was filled with the most magical bikers and their motorcycles. And I drove right into the center of them. And I turned to this young man and I said, "Would you get out of the car?" And to my immense relief, he did. And as I drove away, I turned Roseanne Cash on again, and I thought to myself about what a difference time and circumstance can make in one's perception of safety and the value of $4,000. Thank you.
My name is Phil Simon. The California highway patrolman straightened his hat and he looked me in the eye and he said, "Son, it was bound to happen." It was 1993 and we were on tour. It was the first band I had been booking and doing road management for. They were called International Anthem. And I had booked them a 10-day tour to California. And we were driving south from Oregon. And we were heading into the Northern California town of Ukiah when the Fort Econo line that we were traveling in, and there was only 6 band members and myself and 2 crew guys, a PA and 2 drum sets and a variety of gear. And as we were driving, the van was gripped by an invisible hand on that was grabbing the drivetrain, like, and it made me really nervous. And I was driving, so I pulled into the local mechanic tire shop type of place, and they put it up on the lift, and he said, "Oh man, the whole rear end is shot, and you're gonna have to get another one. It's gonna take about 2-3 days." And I said, well, no, this van and these people are going to Palo Alto tonight. And he said, I don't think so. And I said, well, yes, we are. And I said, everybody back in the van. And we all piled back in the van, and we started. And I don't know how many of you have been to Ukiah, California, but the 5 or 6 miles as you're going south out of there is incredibly curvy and pretty much straight uphill. And I was incredibly tuned into the sound of the drivetrain as I was driving, and much to my amazement, no noises. This is amazing. And at the top of this curvy hill, you reach a plateau that goes about 10 miles straight as an arrow. I'm like, this is fantastic. And we start driving, and I get up to about 60, 65 miles an hour when that sound returns with a vengeance. So I wrestle the van, Ford Econoline, to the side of the road from 65 miles an hour down to 0 pretty quickly, and I put it in a park, and I'm gonna get out to assess the circumstance, and I look in the side mirror, and I see fire leaping out of the rear wheel well as the wheel has exited the vehicle. And I turn in, and in slow motion I scream, "Fire!" At which point, all 8 or 9 of us exit the vehicle very quickly, and I'm on the side of the California highway when a white pickup truck pulls up very fast, and he screeches to a halt. He grabs a fire extinguisher out of the bed of his truck, and he runs across the highway, and he puts out the fire. Well, we're standing there assessing the situation for a second, and I'm looking up the road back northward from whence we came, and I see smoke coming about up from the field there, and the guy who saved us, he looks up too, and he goes, "That must be where your wheel went." And he jumps into the pickup truck, and he races up the road, and I'm starting to panic pretty good, and he comes back 2 or 3 minutes later, and he said, well, the flames are 20 feet tall and 200 feet across, and they're racing across this field. I'm out of here, good luck. And he leaves, and I watch in both amazement and horror as over the next 10 minutes or so, 3 fire engines, a helicopter, and 2 planes arrive to extinguish the fire. Now, when I was a much younger man, I remember being told a story about someone who was driving who had thrown their cigarette out the window and had caused an enormous fire, and that person was presented with the bill for what it took to extinguish this fire. And here I am, I'm about 22 years old, and I'm thinking, this is gonna be a heck of a bill. And the California Highway Patrol arrives and says, "Whose vehicle is this?" And my friend Mark, he raises his hand, and out comes the notepad. He writes down Mark's name, and he said, "Who was driving?" And I raise my hand, and he takes my name down, and I said, "Well, sir, this is awfully unfortunate, but I have to say, this was a lie, an accident, and I don't really feel responsible." And he looks at me, and he adjusts his hat, and he said, "Son, it was bound to happen."
Hi, I'm Karen Fisk. The scene kept playing back in my mind again and again. The gravel and the debris as the car went end over end over end. And the old man who sent us flying off the open road. The day began with an ultimatum. Our son Zoe would not sit in his car seat. And it was a state-of-the-art car seat. Once you got that click done, you could send that kid to the moon. Nothing would happen to them. The problem was the click. And if you had walked by me that morning when I was trying to get Zoe into the car seat, you would have thought I was abusing him. He had his back arched and his shoulders twisted, and he was yelling, "No, no, no." Well, I had it too. At 3 years old, he was actually tall enough and heavy enough to be in a booster seat. So we put him in the booster seat. We clicked up the seat belts, and we were on our way. We were going to a toy wooden boat workshop. And Zoe was in ecstasy at that workshop because they let them use power tools. Not a bandsaw or anything like that, but a power drill. And he made this incredible boat. We had a wonderful day. It was hot and sunny and fun. And as we got back into the car, the only thing we did different was I sat in the back seat to read to Zoe as we went along. I remember looking up in the rearview mirror and smiling at my husband, Andrew, and he smiled back because we had had such a wonderful day. I remember looking over my shoulder and seeing an old man walking along the side of the road. And then it happened. The churning of the gravel and the debris and the car turning, and suddenly the sudden crash and arms pulling me out of the car and yelling for Zoe and somebody putting him into my arms, and then we were in an ambulance, and then we were in the emergency room, and the nurse was running over to me saying, "Was your child in a car seat?" And I just burst out crying because he wasn't in a car seat, and I had no idea if he was okay or not. And then they took us in 2 different directions to do the first aid they needed to do. The next time I saw Zoe, he was in a hospital bed, hopping up and down in the hospital bed. He had a teddy bear under one arm and a lollipop in the other hand, and I remember thinking vaguely, that's not safe. Him hopping up and down in a bed with a lollipop in his hand. He had a bump on his forehead and his eyes were starting to go black, but you know what? He looked pretty good. But then I realized, where's Andrew? Thankfully, just a few minutes later, the curtains opened and there he was. And he looked shell-shocked, but he looked wonderful. And we went home. And in the next days, I just kept going through that accident. It was so scary. It was so awful. And I think I just needed somebody to blame. And I thought about that old man. I thought, he was some sort of devil. He was a demon who had cursed us and sent us off the road. That's what happened. Just about that time, our landlord stopped by. We lived in a small town, and he had heard what had happened. And as soon as he affirmed that we were okay, he pointed to the ceiling. Above us, there was a young woman who had a little boy. All summer long, I had been trying to make friends with her. The 2 kids were the same age. I thought they'd have fun together. But she never let me catch her eye. She was sort of a little vacant, really. And the boy kind of trailed along behind her. I actually never saw them engage with each other. It was very strange. He pointed up at the ceiling and he said, "You know, they were in an accident too. When she was pregnant with him, she walked away. But the little boy and the little girl who she was babysitting were killed." Yeah. Everything changed in my mind when I heard that. I thought, oh my, we could have killed somebody. We could have hit another car. We could have hit that old man. And suddenly that man was not a demon at all. If he was anything, he was an angel. Because nobody died that day. Nobody was killed. Everybody was okay. Thank God.
I'm Robin Varnum. Mark and I were traveling around India by train, 3rd class unreserved. But by the time we got to Bombay, we were running seriously short of money. It was 1973, and we were in our early 20s. We were Peace Corps volunteers based in Afghanistan, and we were on our mid-service break from the Peace Corps. We were traveling with a copy of India on $5 a day and a heavy suitcase. As soon as we got to Delhi, we bought 2 comprehensive railway passes, which entitled us to unlimited travel within India for the next 6 weeks. These passes cost us $20 apiece. But traveling third class was hell, because no one regulated the number of passengers that could crowd onto a third-class car. And often, there were more than 300 people on a car with seats for maybe 150. Every time we came to a station, crowds of passengers anxious to get off would crowd the doorways, and crowds equally anxious to get on would push and shove past them through the doors and through the windows. And vendors would run up to the windows hawking naan, which is Indian bread, and sweet tea in disposable clay cups. We were so crowded, I was always worried about pickpockets. There was a filthy restroom at the end of every car, and the stench of that restroom mingled with the smell of unwashed bodies and of the cheap cigarettes that all the guys were smoking. Mark and I had a good time in India. We saw all the tourist attractions. We saw the Taj Mahal. We went to Benares. We went to Calcutta. But we were spending something more than $5 a day, and by the time we got to Bombay, we were having to pinch pennies. And we still had to get back to Delhi in order to catch our flight back to Afghanistan. So we stood on the platform there in Bombay, and we fought our way onto a third-class car. But we didn't manage to secure seats. So there we were, standing at the far end of the car near the restroom, and there was a lower caste family huddled up against us, father, mother, several kids. I wondered if they were untouchables. The mother was suckling a baby, but she wore no bodice or bra, and her tattered sari did very little to conceal her breasts. As soon as we pulled out of the station, she swung into action. She directed her husband to set our suitcase parallel to the restroom wall to create a little enclosure, and they filled in with their duffel bags. Then she motioned for Mark and me to sit on one of the duffel bags, and she handed a kid to Mark and another kid to me. She and her husband were sitting on the other duffel bag, he holding a third kid and she holding the baby. And we adults were sitting knee to knee, so there was no place for the kids except in our laps. And they were filthy little kids. They had snotty noses and matted hair, and they kept scratching their genitals. They maybe had fleas. We didn't have a common language, but Mark offered the guy a cigarette, and the woman crooned softly to her baby. At supper time, she pulled out a brightly colored plastic basket and handed out pieces of naan to all of us. And at the very next station, Mark bought tea from a vendor for all of us. The trip lasted 30 hours. When we got to Delhi, we spent the last of our cash on a taxi to the airport. At the airport, we were fortunate to run into our Peace Corps friend, Dave Jeffords. We told him that we were leaving India without a rupee to spare. He said, "How are you going to pay the airport tax?" We hadn't known about any airport tax. Dave called us deadbeats, but he pulled out his wallet and he saved us. Thank you.
I'm Andrew Varnon. Varnum, Varnon. Good story. You heard the story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas? I was standing at the copier in Western New England University in the English department with a colleague. Being somebody in the English department, she knew the story. She knew that I had delivered a letter to the chair of the departments and I wasn't going to come back to teach there again in the fall. I was walking away. The thing that the story doesn't tell you at the end is what happens to the ones who walk away. So I said to my colleague, that's what I'm going to find out. I'm going to find out. That's me. I'm going to find out what happens to the ones who walk away. So Omelas is a story by Ursula K. Le Guin, and it's widely anthologized, so it's the kind of story that somebody, if you spend most of your life teaching freshman English classes, that you've heard about, you know about. It has to deal with sort of a paradise city in the middle of a summer festival. And, it's a magical, wonderful place. But you get the idea that the author here is planting a notion in your head that there's something not quite right. You can have anything that you want. You want an orgy? Have an orgy. Naked priestesses walking around in the street. But all that freedom comes with a price. The price in Omelas is the little kid in the basement underneath the town hall that everybody knows about and nobody does anything about. And some people get fed up and they walk away. So that's what I want to tell you a story about. I want to tell you a story about walking away. I spent 12 years at Western New England University. 12 years is a long time. It was long enough that they stopped being a college and started being a university. I had 2 kids. I bought this kilt. I got back into tennis, and now I'm the coach of the high school tennis team. And my title was a senior lecturer, but I was an adjunct instructor. I thought of myself as sort of the Walmart greeter of higher education. You spend your $40,000 and you show up, and you get me. I'm there on a course-by-course basis, and if you run into problems, I refer you to support services because you're a customer and the university wants to retain you. But I'm not going to do that anymore. I've decided to be done, at least in that role. And it was hard the last week. I'd been teaching a class called Beer, Baseball, and the Bible that I really liked. I'd spent 5 years developing. And, it was hard to grade all the papers, and it was hard to, keep a straight face about it. But part of what I did was to be honest with my students and tell them what was happening. I went through my last week. Part of what I did was I pushed my chips into the middle of the table, and I taught Omelas to them, and I talked to them about it. I talked to them about the social contract. I talked to them about the kid in the basement, and the people who live these lives of pure pleasure without any guilt. I got to the last week, and I was trying to make it through. I was trying to teach all the way to the end. I was trying not to quit on my students, but it was hard. I gave what I called my last lecture. I talked to them about what is the value of higher education? Why does your tuition keep going up? It's because what you're buying is status. It's not supposed to be that way. It's supposed to be about social mobility. But if you value an individual's right to think, if you go to college to wake up, if you go to college to expand your mind, if you go to college to adapt to the world, then what I do has value. But if you spend your money buying a fancy new dining commons so rich parents will send their kids to your school, it doesn't feel as valuable. So I walked away that last day. I walked past the copier, past the big 2-story dining commons with a giant golden bear in it, staring out at me, out to my little beat-up Honda Civic, put Carmina Burana in the CD player, and I drove what I think of as the back way past Indian Orchard, Chicopee, Holyoke, Northampton, and Greenfield. Thank you.
That was a lot of variety, different stories. We want to bring all of the storytellers back up on stage to give you a little reminder of everybody that shared a story with you this evening. So what they're going to do is they're going to come back up, tell their name, and share 3 words just to remind you of their story. Hopefully you took notes and you know who you're voting for, but this is a good help. So if we could have all of the storytellers coming up. It's kind of dark back there. I can't see if they're making their way. Oh, okay. Come on up.
Lisa Williams, Highway Patrol. Why?
Jonathan Wilkinson, Tiny Man Cocktails.
Kathryn Petruccelli, Ocean Girl, Desert.
Oran Kaufman, tight bike shorts.
Jenny Power saw some rats.
Julie Bermant, 30 Hitchhikers +1.
Phil Simon, Fiery Field Fibbing.
Karen Fisk, no car seat.
Robin Varnum, 3rd class, unreserved.
Andrew Varnon, walking away.
Let's give it up for all of our storytellers this evening. Okay, so now the hard part is in your hands. You get to vote for your top 2 favorite stories of the evening. So before I share who will be joining us at the Best of Valley Voices, which will be held at the Academy of Music on September 28th, I want to thank all of you for coming out and wrapping up this series with us tonight. It's been a really fun event series, so thank you for joining us. I also want to thank the storytellers that came up here and shared a little bit of their life with us tonight. It takes a lot to come up on stage and share a true story within 5 minutes, too. So thank you, all of you, for joining us. The Best of Valley Voices is going to be a combination of all the winners of the Valley Voices Story Slam. And this year, because it was our 5th year, we held 5 shows. So we're going to have 15 people out sharing with us on different themes. We held one on Busted. We held one TMI, which was a fun night. We held another one that was In the Mood, and the other one was Family Ties. So Open Road, like I said, it wrapped it up for us. So without further ado, in 3rd place with Angels Looking Over, Karen. And you can come on up here, give everybody a wave. It's really hard to see back there, so I can't see any movement until they get up here, Karen. Yay! And 2nd is Brownies and Bargains, Jenny. Ah! Hi, Jenny. Okay, and then placing first in tonight's Story Slam, who again will be joining us on stage at the Best of Valley Voices, September 28th, is Brush Fires with Phil. So congratulations, and congratulations to everybody who shared. Thank you again to Hawks and Reed for hosting this evening, and again, thank you for coming out. Please join us at the Academy on the 28th. Have a good evening.